The hum of the engines vibrated through the cabin as the plane taxied down the runway, preparing for takeoff. Passengers settled in, flipping through magazines, adjusting their seatbelts, scrolling mindlessly on their phones. The air was thick with the usual mix of excitement and impatience. Everyone just wanted to get where they were going. But in the first-class section, tension quietly crackled in the air. Seated in 2A was a 14-year-old boy, Devin Carter. Hoodie pulled over his head, hands resting on the armrests, eyes locked on the window, watching the airport shrink behind them. This was his first time flying alone, a reward from his dad for acing his exams. He had never sat in first class before, and honestly, he hadn't expected to. But his father had handed him the ticket with a proud smile, telling him he deserved it. Devin wasn't nervous. He belonged here. At least, that's what he thought. A shadow fell over him. "Excuse me," a sharp voice cut through the cabin noise. Devin turned his head. A flight attendant stood over him, hands planted on her hips, her name tag gleaming under the soft lighting. Susan Rivera. Her uniform was crisp, her expression unreadable, but something in her eyes made Devin's stomach twist. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" she asked, loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. Devin blinked, confused. Yeah, seat 2A. Susan's eyes flicked to his hoodie, then back to his face. "Let me see your ticket." Devin reached into his pocket, pulled out the boarding pass, and handed it to her. She barely glanced at it before shaking her head. "This is a first-class seat," she said, her tone shifting from professional to something else, something colder. Devin frowned. "I know," a beat of silence. "Where are your parents?" she asked, voice still loud, still sharp. Devin's chest tightened. He could feel the weight of the passengers' eyes now, the way conversations had dipped into a hushed murmur. The businessman in the next seat shifted, pretending to be focused on his newspaper. The woman across the aisle adjusted her sunglasses, but didn't say a word. "I'm traveling alone," Devin said, his voice steady, despite the warmth creeping up his neck. Susan's lips pressed into a thin line. "I see." She handed the ticket back, then took a step closer. "Unfortunately, there must have been a mistake. This seat is reserved for first-class passengers only." Devin's fingers clenched around the boarding pass. "I am a first-class passenger." Her smile was tight, forced. "I think there's been some confusion. You need to take your things and move to economy." A heavy silence settled over the cabin. Devin hesitated. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from something heavier. He had done nothing wrong. He had the ticket. He had been given this seat. And yet here he was, being told loudly that he didn't belong. Passengers were watching. No one was speaking up. Slowly, reluctantly, Devin reached down, grabbed his backpack, and stood. His legs felt unsteady as he stepped into the aisle. Susan didn't offer to help. She simply turned, motioning toward the back of the plane. "Right this way." Devin walked past the rows of plush first-class seats, past the passengers who had witnessed everything but said nothing. His face burned, but he kept his head up. He wasn't going to let them see how much this moment stung. He stepped into the economy section, found an empty seat, and sank into it. Everything felt different here. The seats were smaller, the space tighter. The air itself felt heavier. Without thinking, he pulled out his phone and typed a quick message. "They made me move to the back, said I couldn't sit in first class. I had my ticket. She didn't believe me." His thumb hovered over the send button for half a second before pressing it. The response came almost instantly. "What do you mean they made you move? Who made you move?" Devin's stomach twisted. His father's messages were always straight to the point, never emotional, never dramatic. But something about the way those words appeared on the screen made Devin grip his phone tighter. He hesitated, then typed, "The flight attendant. She said there was a mistake. She wouldn't listen." This time, the reply took longer. For a full 5 seconds, the dots blinked on the screen before a new message appeared. "What's the flight number?" Devin's fingers trembled slightly as he checked the boarding pass and typed it out. He hit send and stared at the screen, waiting. The reply came almost instantly. "Stay where you are. I'll handle it." Devin exhaled, closing his eyes for a moment. He didn't know exactly what his father meant, but something in those words told him that this wasn't over, not even close. The plane had reached cruising altitude, the hum of the engine steady. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks. Conversations picked up again, the tension from earlier fading, at least for most passengers. Devin sat stiffly in his economy seat, staring at his phone. His father hadn't sent another message, but he knew better than to think the situation was over. His dad didn't overreact. He didn't waste words. If he said he would handle it, he meant it. But what did that even mean? He glanced toward the front of the plane, toward the first-class section where he should have been sitting. He could just make out the edge of the curtain that separated economy from the more spacious cabin. The divide felt more than just physical now. Susan Rivera, the flight attendant who had moved him, was back in first class, handing out drinks like nothing had happened. She didn't even glance toward the back of the plane. Devon's phone vibrated. "Do not move. Do not say anything else to her. Just sit tight." His father's words sent a strange chill through him. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. Meanwhile, in the galley at the front of the plane, Susan was busy stacking trays when another flight attendant, a younger woman named Lisa, hesitated before speaking. You sure about that kid?" Lisa asked cautiously. Susan didn't even look up. "What do you mean?" Lisa shifted her weight. "I mean, you didn't check the system. You didn't confirm anything." Susan scoffed, adjusting her uniform. "Please, you saw him. Do you really think he paid for first class?" Lisa frowned. "I've seen all kinds of people in first class. Why assume he didn't?" Susan rolled her eyes. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I know when someone's in the wrong section." Lisa didn't argue, but the uneasy feeling in her gut only grew. Then, the intercom crackled. "Miss Rivera, please report to the cockpit immediately." Susan stiffened. Flight attendants didn't get called to the cockpit unless something was wrong. The other crew members exchanged glances, sensing the shift in energy. She straightened her shoulders and walked to the front of the plane, her heels clicking against the floor. As she stepped inside the cockpit, the atmosphere changed. The captain, a seasoned pilot with graying hair, turned to face her. But he wasn't alone. On the small screen of the in-flight communication system was a live video feed. A man sat in a high-rise office, his hands folded neatly on his desk, his expression unreadable. Susan's breath caught. She didn't recognize him, but she could feel his authority through the screen. "Miss Rivera," the man said, his voice cool and measured. "Do you know who I am?" She swallowed, suddenly uneasy. "No, sir?" The captain spoke this time, his tone firm. "This is Daniel Carter, CEO of this airline." The color drained from Susan's face. The man on the screen didn't raise his voice, didn't show anger, but his words landed like a hammer. "You removed my son from first class without verifying his ticket, without checking the system, without reason." Susan felt the weight of every passenger's gaze from earlier. She had been so sure of herself, so sure she was in control. Now, she wasn't in control of anything. "You are going to turn around," Daniel Carter continued. "Walk back to economy and personally return my son to his seat. And when this flight lands, you will explain yourself to the executive board." The screen went black. For the first time in her career, Susan felt something she had never felt before. Panic. Susan stood frozen in the cockpit, her breath shallow. The silence in the small space pressed against her, suffocating. The captain didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His eyes held the weight of what had just happened. She forced her legs to move, stepping out of the cockpit, her hands trembling at her sides. The moment she entered the first-class cabin, she felt it, the shift. Passengers who had barely acknowledged her presence before now stole glances. Some looked away quickly, pretending not to notice, but she knew better. They had seen her confidence earlier. Now they saw something else. Humiliation. Her fingers hovered over the curtain separating first class from economy. Just a thin piece of fabric, but it might as well have been a wall. She hesitated, just for a second. Then she pulled it aside and stepped through. Devon sat by the window, his posture relaxed, his phone resting in his lap. He didn't look up right away. It was like he already knew she was coming. The surrounding passengers glanced between them, waiting. Susan cleared her throat, crouching slightly to his level. "Sir," she began, forcing a smile, "there's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat." Devon tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "A misunderstanding?" She nodded quickly. "Yes, there was an error in seating." Devon's voice was calm, too calm. "I had my ticket. You saw it, and you still told me to move." A murmur spread through the nearby rows. They had heard everything. Susan swallowed hard. "I may have made a mistake in judgment," she admitted, her voice lower. "But I'd like to correct it now." Devon didn't answer right away. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply watched her, letting the silence stretch longer than she was comfortable with. Then, without a word, he reached for his phone and typed something. A second later, Susan's work tablet vibrated in her pocket. Her stomach clenched as she pulled it out. A message had been forwarded from the airline's executive office. Take your time. Make her understand what she did. Susan's throat tightened. Devon looked at her again, his voice even. I'll go back, he said, but I want to know why you thought I didn't belong here. A hush fell over the cabin. Susan's lips parted, but no words came out. Because for the first time in her career, she realized she didn't have an answer. Susan's mouth felt dry. She could feel the weight of every passenger's gaze, their silent judgment pressing down on her. The boy wasn't yelling, wasn't making a scene. He was just waiting, and somehow that made it worse. She had spent years in the air, handling difficult customers, keeping the cabin in order. She knew how to smooth over situations, how to make complaints disappear. But this wasn't a misunderstanding she could brush aside. This wasn't just a passenger demanding an upgrade or arguing about baggage fees. This was different. I didn't think, she started, but Devon cut her off. But you did. His voice was steady, controlled. You didn't ask anyone else in first class for their ticket, just me. Her throat tightened. The passengers in the surrounding rows shifted uncomfortably, some sneaking glances, others pretending not to listen. But they were all paying attention now. Susan felt the heat rise to her cheeks. She had always been the one in control, the one making the rules. But now the balance had shifted, and she didn't know how to get it back. She inhaled sharply. I misjudged you. Devon held her gaze for a moment, then, finally, he reached for his backpack. He didn't gloat, he didn't smirk. He simply stood up and walked past her back toward first class. The walk through the cabin was silent. Passengers who had ignored him before now watched him closely. Some looked embarrassed. Others quickly looked away. No one had spoken up when he was removed, and now no one knew what to say. Susan followed behind, every step feeling heavier than the last. Devon reached his seat, sat down, and calmly placed his bag beside him. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. Susan lingered for a moment, unsure of what to do. She had always known exactly how to handle situations like this, except she never had. Not really. If there's anything you need, she mumbled, forcing herself to meet his eyes, please let me know. Devon didn't even look at her. He simply opened his book and turned the page. The conversation was over. Susan turned stiffly and hurried back to the galley, her face burning. She had never felt so small in her entire career, and for the first time she wasn't sure what would happen next. Susan moved quickly back to the galley, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as she steadied herself. The usual hum of the cabin surrounded her, but everything felt different now. Her uniform, once a symbol of authority, now felt suffocatingly tight. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her, heavier than anything she had ever experienced on a flight. Lisa, the younger flight attendant, stood nearby, carefully stacking drink trays. She didn't say anything at first, but Susan could feel her watching. Finally, Lisa spoke. That didn't go well, huh? Susan shot her a sharp look. Mind your own business, Lisa raised an eyebrow. I think it is my business. You embarrassed that kid in front of the whole plane, and now it turns out his dad owns the airline? I'd be sweating too if I were you. Susan clenched her jaw, turning away. She reached for a glass, carefully pouring sparkling water, her hands a little too tight around the bottle. She needed to keep working, to act normal, to pretend she was still in control. Then the in-flight phone rang. A fresh wave of tension spread through her chest as she glanced at the receiver. No one else moved to answer it. Lisa smirked slightly. I think that's for you. Susan inhaled sharply, then picked up the phone, pressing it to her ear. This is Rivera, she said, forcing her voice to stay level. A deep, calm voice filled her ear. This is Captain Hughes. A pause. Then, when we land, you'll be escorted directly to a meeting with airline executives. Mr. Carter has requested a formal review of your conduct on this flight. Susan felt her stomach drop. Her fingers tightened around the phone. I understand, she managed to say, though her throat was dry. The line clicked off. For a long moment, she didn't move. Lisa's voice broke the silence. They're not waiting for a report, are they? Susan exhaled shakily, placing the phone back on the hook. She knew exactly what this meant. A formal review, a disciplinary hearing. She had seen this happen before, to other flight attendants, the ones who made mistakes big enough to reach corporate before the plane even landed. But those had always been other people, never her. The thought made her legs feel weak. She had spent years enforcing the rules, making sure the cabin ran smoothly, keeping everything in order, and yet in a single moment, a single assumption, she had unraveled everything. She swallowed hard and turned back to Lisa, who was still watching her. "Get back to work," Susan snapped, but her voice lacked its usual sharpness. Lisa didn't argue. She simply gave her one last look before turning away. Susan leaned against the counter, gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had never wanted a flight to be over so badly, but she had a sinking feeling that when they landed, her problems were only just beginning. The plane cruised steadily through the sky, but for Susan, time had slowed to a crawl. Every small task, pouring drinks, adjusting trays, answering passengers, felt like a distraction, a flimsy attempt to ignore the reality waiting for her on the ground. She had always prided herself on staying composed under pressure, but this was different. This wasn't just a difficult passenger or a minor complaint. This was something bigger. She could feel the shift in the cabin, the quiet glances from first-class passengers, the way the other flight attendants avoided her gaze. Even Lisa, who usually had something to say, kept her distance. They all knew. They might not have the details, but they knew enough. Susan forced herself to move through the motions. She walked back to first class, trying to carry herself with the same confidence as before, but she could tell it wasn't working. She wasn't in control of this flight anymore. Devin sat comfortably in his seat, flipping through the in-flight magazine. He wasn't smug. He wasn't gloating. He just was, as if nothing that had happened earlier had fazed him at all. That made it worse. If he had been angry, if he had lashed out, she could have justified it to herself, told herself he was just another difficult passenger. But he hadn't. She stopped beside his seat, clearing her throat. "Can I offer you something to drink?" she asked, forcing her voice to sound as smooth as usual. "Maybe a snack?" Devin didn't respond right away. He turned a page, as if deciding whether or not she was worth acknowledging. Then finally he glanced up. "A drink?" he repeated. "Yes," Susan said quickly. "Anything you'd like. We have fresh juice, sparkling water, tea." "You didn't ask me that before." Susan blinked. "Excuse me?" "When I first sat down," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you didn't offer me anything. You didn't even greet me like you did with the other first-class passengers." The words hit harder than she expected. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Passengers nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. The businessman in 3C shifted uncomfortably. The woman across the aisle lowered her tablet just enough to peek over it. The air in the cabin felt heavy. I didn't mean—" "But you did," Devin interrupted, his voice even. "You just didn't expect to be questioned about it." Susan swallowed hard, her hands clenched behind her back. She had always been the one setting the rules, making sure things ran smoothly. But now, she was standing in front of a kid, a teenager, who wasn't afraid to hold her accountable. A long pause stretched between them. Then finally, Devin shrugged. "I'll have a sparkling water." Susan nodded quickly, relieved for the escape. "Of course," she said, turning back toward the galley. As she reached for a glass, Lisa smirked. "That didn't go well, did it?" Susan ignored her, carefully pouring the drink, making sure everything was perfect. She walked back to Devin's seat and placed the glass gently on his tray table, hoping that would be the end of it. But as she turned to leave, his voice stopped her again. "By the way," he said, picking up his phone, "I just texted my dad about you." Susan's stomach twisted. She forced a tight smile. "I see." Devin took a slow sip of his drink, watching her. "Yeah, he wasn't happy." Susan already knew that. She had heard it in his father's voice, but hearing the boy say it so casually, with quiet confidence, made her stomach churn even more. "I guess we'll see what happens when we land," he added, flipping another page in the magazine. Susan stiffened, nodded quickly, then walked away. She had never wanted a flight to end so badly, but deep down she knew her problems were just beginning. Susan moved swiftly back to the galley, but no matter how quickly she walked, she couldn't outrun the sinking feeling in her chest. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, heavier than ever. The usual noise of the plane, the murmur of passengers, the clinking of glasses, the hum of the engines felt distant. All she could focus on was the clock, counting down the minutes until they landed. She reached the galley, gripping the counter with both hands, her knuckles turning white. She had handled plenty of tough flights before, angry passengers, medical emergencies, last-minute reroutes, but nothing had ever felt like this. This wasn't just about a seat assignment. This wasn't about customer service. This was about her. Lisa was still there, casually organizing meal trays. She glanced up, her expression unreadable. "You good?" she asked. Susan exhaled sharply. I don't need your sympathy. Lisa shrugged. I wasn't offering sympathy. Just wondering if you're ready for what's coming when we land. Susan stiffened. Nothing is coming. It was a misunderstanding. Lisa let out a quiet scoff. A misunderstanding? She crossed her arms. Because from where I was standing, it looked like you decided a first-class passenger didn't belong based on nothing but how he looked. Susan's jaw tightened. I followed protocol. Lisa's eyebrows lifted. Did you? Because I don't remember protocol saying to move a passenger without checking the manifest first, or questioning a kid about where his parents are when his name is clearly on the reservation. Susan looked away. She hated this, being questioned, being doubted. But what she hated more was the feeling creeping up in her chest, the one whispering that Lisa was right. Before she could respond, the in-flight phone rang. The sound sent a fresh wave of tension through her. No one else moved to answer it. Lisa smirked slightly. I definitely think that's for you. Susan swallowed hard, then reached for the receiver, pressing it to her ear. This is Rivera, she said, trying to steady her voice. A deep, calm voice spoke on the other end. This is Jordan Carter. Her grip on the phone tightened. You will personally file a full incident report as soon as this flight lands, he continued, his voice cold as steel. I expect a detailed explanation of why my son was removed from his seat despite having a valid ticket. Susan opened her mouth, but no words came out. You will also ensure that for the remainder of this flight, my son receives the same service as every other first-class passenger, Carter added. Nothing less. Yes, sir, she whispered. The call ended with a soft click. Susan placed the phone back on the hook, her hands clammy. She had made a serious mistake, one she couldn't take back. And now, she wasn't just dealing with a passenger complaint. She was dealing with the man who owned the sky she was flying in. The plane began its slow descent, the seatbelt sign dinging overhead. Passengers straightened in their seats, closing laptops, tucking away books, the usual routine. But for Susan, nothing felt routine anymore. The quiet hum of the cabin felt suffocating. Every movement felt heavier, like she was walking through deep water. She stood in the galley, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, staring at nothing. The message from Jordan Carter echoed in her mind. You made a decision. Now live with it. A lump formed in her throat. Lisa walked past, pausing just long enough to say, you should probably start thinking about what you're going to say when we land. Susan didn't respond. She couldn't. Through the curtain, she saw Devin sitting calmly in 2A, flipping through his magazine, as if the last few hours hadn't changed anything. The contrast between them was stark. He was calm. She was unraveling. The plane touched down smoothly, but inside, Susan felt like she was crashing. Passengers started gathering their belongings, stretching, chatting about connecting flights and hotel reservations. Meanwhile, she sat frozen, gripping the intercom phone with numb fingers. A voice crackled through the speaker above her. Miss Rivera, you are to remain on the aircraft. A company representative will meet you at the gate. Her stomach twisted. One by one, the first-class passengers exited. The businessman, the woman with sunglasses, all of them slipping back into their lives, onto their next destinations. Then, finally, Devin stood. He adjusted his hoodie, slung his backpack over one shoulder, and stepped into the aisle. He turned, looking at Susan for the first time since returning to first class. There was no smirk, no anger, just a quiet curiosity. She opened her mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to say something, anything, that would make her feel in control again. But Devin just studied her for a moment. Then with the smallest nod, he turned and walked off the plane. And just like that, he was gone. The doors closed. The cabin was empty now, except for the crew. The silence was deafening. Then the jet bridge moved. A figure stepped inside. Not security, not a corporate executive. Jordan Carter himself. Susan's breath caught. Susan's breath hitched. She looked up, but Jordan was already turning toward the exit. He stopped just before stepping off the plane and glanced back. Now let's see if you forgive yourself. Then he was gone. And for the first time, Susan wasn't thinking about her job. She was thinking about who she really was.
This content is a work of fiction and art designed for entertainment and educational purposes. Any similarities to real individuals or events are purely coincidental. Certain scenes and dialogues in the video are dramatized and contain elements of grotesque, satire, and exaggeration. The creator firmly opposes discrimination, violence, and hatred. This channel adheres to YouTube's guidelines and respects copyright laws.